By the way, that brings us to our two tools. Yeah, sorry, as I say, we only had like 3 months to develop this whole thing from scratch. There were 3 tools designed, only 2 tools implemented. I'll tell you about the one that didn't make it in, but to be honest, I think it's almost for the better. It's one of those things where, like, it could have worked, but it would have taken so much work, it would probably have been a bit of a mess. And this might be a bit of a weird way of thinking about it, but the one that didn't make it in was the one that was supposed to go in slot 2, so we kind of got tool 1 and 3, but not 2. Either way, I must admit, I did break a little bit with the convention of having the most beginner-friendly tool be the one in slot 1, because, well, it made sense for the ship and for the weapon, but all of the tools, being the special abilities, are a bit wacky and a bit out there. So there isn't really a beginner-friendly one. So arguably you could even say the Demolition Kit, the one in slot 1, is the most high-skill one. But I thought I'd still put it there because I think it's the one with the most basic understanding of, like, the use of it, even if using it to its fullest potential is probably a bit harder than the other tools that you have available. Each tool gives you access to 2 special abilities as well as a passive, although the passive usually is in relation to those abilities. And in the case of the Demolition Kit, you get access to 2 new abilities, the Forceplosions and the Steel Splitter. Forceplosions is the only ability in the game, at least in its current state, which actually has multiple charges. When you use it, it only takes 1/3 of the bar, and you can use up to 3 of them in a row. As well as that, it only takes 6 seconds to charge up a new one, so you get these things pretty fast. And Forceplosions are essentially rockets, like with the rocket launcher. Except they don't deal damage. They have smaller blue explosions which don't deal damage but instead launch people even harder than the rocket's explosions do. As well as that, the lifespan of these projectiles is quite short, so you can't shoot these as far as rockets, although they do travel faster. At first these might seem quite strange. I mean, sure, you can launch people all over the place with them, but I mean, what's the actual use here? If you shoot them at an enemy, you might be able to displace them, but you won't actually hurt them. Well, you'll pretty quickly figure out it's to rocket jump. Even if you aren't using the rocket launcher, you can still rocket jump so long as you take the Demolition Kit and use Forceplosions to do it. But even still, it might seem like it's a bit of a narrow use case, especially because you can't just rocket jump in place. There has to be a nearby wall or something for you to detonate the explosion off of. Because there was actually 2 more uses for them which sort of emerged as we were playing that we didn't expect. One of them is that Forceplosions were actually pretty effective with the machine gun, because if you were able to simply hold down shoot with the machine gun and spray a bunch of bullets, if you needed to instantly move backwards as fast as possible, you could simply launch a Forceplosion while shooting your machine gun bullets, and almost certainly one of your machine gun bullets would shoot the Forceplosion as soon as it spawned, causing it to blow up in front of you rather than behind you, and send you launching backwards. And that can be really helpful because then you don't need to Forceplode off a wall. If you need to rocket jump right now to dodge something but you aren't close enough to a wall, you could combine it with a machine gun to essentially detonate your own explosions on top of yourself and launch yourself in different directions. Beyond that, one other very unexpected use that I saw is that as we were test playing, people started actually using them as a sort of parry mechanic, where they would fire Forceplosions at incoming bullets just explicitly to have the bullets hit the rocket of the Forceplosion instead of them, and then have the bullet get destroyed by the rocket. This is pretty risky to go for, it's easy to miss, and of course it only negates 1 hit, but especially if that 1 hit was going to be something like a fully charged slingshot hit, that can be a really nice way to negate some damage and get out of something alive. But with that said, if you want to do some real damage, you'd have to use the Steel Splitter. The Steel Splitter fires a big, extremely fast traveling and heavy bullet right at your enemy that glows bright red. And when it hits them, not only does it do a pretty large amount of damage for a single bullet, and not only does it hit them real hard, real fast, but on top of that, they'll start glowing red. This is to indicate that their armor has been pierced, and now it's only going to be 50% effective, meaning that all of your shots would do increased damage until it wears off in 10 seconds. The ability itself has a 20-second cooldown. Now, unfortunately, that does mean that the effectiveness of this debuff kind of depends on your ship. If it's the Comet Chaser, it's barely going to do anything. You're going to go from 10% armor to 5% armor. So you are going to do, like, just over 5% more damage, but you know, it's not a big difference. Of course, on the other hand, against the Astral Anchor, this will be a massive deal. It will reduce their damage reduction all the way from 50% to 25% for a bit. But this is also why we insisted on making the bullet do a lot of damage on impact and also be very heavy. That meant that even if somehow the ship had no armor, you'd still at least do a good amount of damage on impact for landing the shot. And on top of that, the fact that it's heavy means that it's going to have the most effect on lighter ships in terms of knockback. So don't get me wrong, the Comet Chaser definitely is the ship that is the least affected by the Steel Splitter, but at the very least you do a good amount of damage to it on impact, even if the damage debuff isn't that big a deal, and you are able to launch the Comet Chaser real hard from landing a shot with the Steel Splitter, whereas you probably wouldn't move the Astral Anchor much when you hit it, although you will be able to reduce its armor a lot more. Typically, heavier ships have more armor, so it only makes sense to also make this knock back the lighter ships as hard as possible to sort of counterbalance the fact that the armor reduction isn't going to be as big a deal. And that just leaves the passive, which actually synergizes with the Steel Splitter, because the passive of the Demolition Kit is that dealing damage gets your cooldowns back faster. And that does mean if you really get to do a lot of damage in a short window of time, you are able to completely keep someone locked in the sort of armor-pierced state. Now don't get me wrong, if that sounds scary, you must realize that it's very difficult to do this, and you'll very rarely get more than 2 of these in a row. But yes, in theory, if you get a lot of burst damage in, it is possible to split someone's armor, do a bunch of damage, and thanks to the increased damage you're doing from splitting their armor, get your cooldowns back so fast that you get your next Steel Splitter before the 10-second duration wears off, and get a refresh on the duration of the armor-piercing debuff, so that you can keep them all red and easy to blow up. Definitely the Demolition Kit has been a favorite in terms of pure fun factor. The second tool that was going to be added to the game that got removed was the Magna-Tech. Now you gotta understand that a lot of these ideas, we didn't have the opportunity to play with them until literally just like a couple weeks before, you know, it's actually gotta be done. When making a game, the progress is very much exponential. It takes ages just to get from nothing to something, and then to get from something to actually having a bit of a playable, proper game, but then it's very quick adding more stuff once you've actually got like something to work with, a real game you can sit down and play. That's all to say that this idea seemed like it had a lot more of a chance of working and not needing a whole bunch of extra effort to get working back when it was all kind of on paper. And then when I saw the game actually playing out, I realized this is going to be a tough one. Essentially, I really wanted to take advantage of how physics-based the game was. The second tool was going to be the Magna-Tech. The Magna-Tech, instead of having 2 separate cooldowns for its 2 abilities, would essentially have 1 resource meter that both abilities would share. And its 2 abilities would be the Attractor Beam and the Repulsor Blast, essentially allowing you to project a cone out in front of you that would either attract other objects, players, bullets, etc. towards you, or push them away, with pushing them away being more expensive to use on your resources because, of course, there's going to be more situations where you're going to want to push bullets away from your direction. However, the Attractor Beam would still have use, not only to pull enemies in closer, but also because you could use it to curve the trajectory of bullets mid-air without actually pulling them into you, so to speak. Not to mention, it could be used on some of the game's maps to actually move geometry and maybe shuffle cover around. Lastly, the passive here would be pretty simple. Since the resource you would be spending would be called magnetic charge, you'd be able to generate more magnetic charge by bonking into things. Whenever your player was involved in any collision, it would take the total force applied to the player as a result of that collision and convert that into more magnetic charge to feed your abilities. Essentially, because you get to push and pull things around with the Magna-Tech, you'd be rewarded for bonking into as many things as possible and launching yourself all over the place. Again, because of how physics-oriented this game is, this all seemed like a very sound idea in my head. The problem is, once we actually get to sit down and play the game, I'm realizing a lot of issues with the actual implementation. How am I going to visually represent the attracting and the repulsing force? I've got to now program a specialized condition for a cone hitbox rather than a sphere hitbox. As well as that, I still wasn't entirely sure whether I wanted the blast and the beam to be a press the button one and done, or a continuous, you hold it and it spends resources and it pulls things gradually. I kind of like the pulling things gradually better for the idea of curving bullets around, but the issue is if you do it that way, how on earth are we going to make that work when bullets fly through the air so fast that you probably won't be able to hold the cone on them for very long? And so while I thought this was a really cool idea, it was pretty clear to see it wasn't quite there. It's the kind of idea which I still stand by. Like, I think if you had loads of time to work on this game, you could make this idea work and be really cool. The problem is, knowing that we have so little time to work with, this seemed like it was going to be a nightmare to implement, so we skipped over it. And instead we moved on to the final tool, the Evasion Phasers, which ironically enough was the first one we programmed because it was going to be the easiest to program. The Evasion Phasers are made for the more avoidant playstyles. They have a pretty simple theme of being able to phase through solid objects, and both your abilities stick to this theme. Your first ability is Phase Cancellation. When you activate it, your ship starts glowing green, and for the next 4 seconds, you can go right through all walls and all collision. You can go anywhere you want, nothing can stop you. However, when you press this ability, the position you activate it in will be memorized, and then when the ability wears off, you will be teleported back to that location. Now, I will fully admit, the initial idea was not to do this. The initial idea was just the phasing through walls, but understandably, there was concern about getting stuck in walls. In theory, that shouldn't have been an issue. In theory, if the teleportation thing isn't there, you should still get pushed out of walls if you launch yourself in one, you know? The game should knock you out. But in fairness, yeah, it definitely was going to be a little bit weird and sketchy, and definitely a little bit, oh god, this might be a bit bug prone for no reason. And so the idea to teleport you back kind of got brought up, and I actually thought that was a pretty damn good idea. Because while it is a workaround, at the same time, in fairness, it's not like it makes the ability feel worse to use. If anything, it makes it feel better. Because the Evasion Phasers, typically its abilities tend to feel like they're either insanely useful or pretty useless. It's obviously very context dependent, and it just feels like the abilities for the Evasion Phasers, the times at which they're effective are pretty rare, but when they're effective, they're really effective. And so to try and smooth that out, it would be nice to make them a bit more multi-purpose, and in a kind of unintentional way, that's what we're doing by making Phase Cancellation also teleport you back when it runs out, because now it can be used both as a way to recall back to your location 4 seconds ago, as well as being used to phase through walls, or hide inside cover. There's a lot of ways you can go about using this. You can go for surprise attacks where an enemy thinks that you can't reach them because there's a wall between you, and then you just like phase out of existence. Say you're using the rocket launcher, you rocket jump through the wall and suddenly direct hit them, surprise motherfucker, and then before they can react, you teleport back to the other side of the wall because the ability just ran out. If you want to, you can just use it to hide inside a wall where you can't be shot, but even then, that only gives you 4 seconds of respite, and then when it's over, if they've been paying attention, they know exactly where you're going to teleport back to when it runs out, so they're going to be ready to ambush you the second that you're forced out of there. Hell, sometimes you can kind of do the opposite of the rocket launcher thing, especially with the slingshot, and use the initial phase through walls as an escape, charge up your shot, and then when you teleport back, instantly, the second you teleport back, fire off your shot for like a surprise attack. Sort of instead of using the phasing through walls as a surprise attack and the teleport as the retreat, instead you're using the phase through walls as the retreat and the teleport as the surprise attack. It does have a lot of sort of multifaceted uses. That being said, it does have a 12-second cooldown. It cannot be used super frequently. Obviously, if it could, you could hide inside walls all game. But that brings us to the second ability, Unreal Ammunition, which when used for the next few seconds, allows your shots to go right through walls. Now, don't get me wrong, this ability might sound terrifying on the face of it to begin with, because it completely removes cover as an option. But once again, you gotta remember that distance makes it really hard to land shots in this game, again, since everything has a travel time. If you're picking the rocket launcher and you activate this ability, and you're trying to shoot someone on the other side of the map, even if you're trying to get them through walls, you're gonna have quite a hard time landing a direct rocket hit on them. Not unless you can surprise them, that is. Which in fairness you can sometimes do, since you won't be able to see the rockets while they're phasing through the walls. That being said, obviously given the right time and context, being able to shoot through walls can be an extremely terrifying ability. And I wasn't completely unaware of that fact, and so that is of course why I made it so that this ability has a 24-second cooldown, the longest of all abilities in the game. It cannot be used very frequently, but that's kind of fine anyway, because already typically it is an ability that is used relatively rarely. But once again, when it finds its situation where it's impactful, it can be enormous. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to this ability is that it actually isn't quite as terrifying as you'd think with most weapons. Not only did I mention that the rockets take a long time to reach their target, and so it's difficult to use them effectively with Unreal ammunition, but on top of that, it also kind of bites the slingshot player in the ass a little bit too, unless they can use it very skillfully. Because of the fact that, yes, sure, now their shots can go through walls and they travel a lot faster. However, they lose the ability to bounce their shots, because, well, you can't bounce your shots off walls if your shots go through walls. Although this does also incidentally lead to the extremely cool little interaction happening, where you can fire a bullet, time it so that the Unreal ammunition buff wears off mid-air, like as the bullet traverses through the wall, and then have the bullet go back to bouncing after you've already fired it off by timing the shot correctly. If you can do that, you can get some really cool situations where you can shoot right through an object and then bounce it around after it's phased through that first wall and still get a bounce shot on someone while phasing it through a wall. But that does require very precise timing, and you will only get one shot like that per activation of the ability, which again has the longest cooldown of all abilities in the game. Lastly comes the passive ability, or in this tool's special case, passive abilities. You see, there's both a negative one and a positive one when it comes to this one. The negative passive is that it is the opposite of the Magna-Tech. Essentially, whenever you collide with anything as a player, you actually get longer cooldowns relative to the amount of force applied to you. It is the Evasion Phasers. They're supposed to interact with reality as little as possible. And so, if things go bonking into them when you don't have the ability to phase through them, you're going to get longer cooldowns on your abilities. This also helps punish you for playing too scummy with the Evasion Phasers, by making it so that if someone wants to get in your face to win, but you're not letting them because you're using the Evasion Phasers to run away constantly and shoot them through walls, then obviously anytime they do manage to get in, the more they get to bonk you around and launch you all over the place, the longer you're going to have to wait for your next usage of your abilities. But of course, that's a negative, so what about the positive passive ability? The positive passive ability is a pretty simple one, but one that opens a whole bunch of doors. And it is quite simply that you get a second charge of the burst dash ability. So you can use 2 in a row. Now, unfortunately, we didn't get that to be displayed correctly on the screen in time. It is correctly implemented, but the purple dash bar does not show 2 charges, even though you have 2 charges. So sometimes it can be a little bit confusing knowing visually when you have the charge or not. But either way, you get 2 charges of the dash, and that can be huge. Not only does it make yourself a lot harder to shoot when you have 2 dashes in a row, but it also really allows you to go for fake outs where you can quickly dash in one direction just to maybe avoid one bullet, make the enemy think you're retreating, and then suddenly dash back in the other direction and just go right at them at ramming speed. All that said, considering these are the special abilities in the game, even though there's only 2 of them, you might have expected that the tools would be extremely hard to balance. And that's kind of what I expected would be the case, but surprisingly no. We barely had to make any changes to them at all. In fact, now I think about it, I think the only change we ever made to the abilities was increasing the damage of the Steel Splitter to help compensate for it not being as effective against the Comet Chaser, and making it heavier. And then when we went too far, we reduced the damage back down a bit, because there was a period where the Steel Splitter did too much damage on impact. In terms of cooldowns, anything like that, we didn't really have to change anything. At the end of the day, both of these abilities are so different and give such crazy benefits that they always have their situations. I guess intuitively, a lot of the time it can feel like the Demolition Kit is the more strong one out of the 2. And I think that is potentially true, considering that I think that rocket jumping with Forceplosions has a higher skill ceiling. But generally, these 2 abilities tend to feel pretty evenly matched, at least provided you're using a loadout that makes sense with those abilities. I guess it feels so even because the Demolition Kit gives you unparalleled movement potential as well as scary burst damage if you can master them and use them effectively. But by the same token, the double dash of the Evasion Phasers gives you such an effective ability to dodge, as well as the fact that your abilities can make it so even if people can outrun you and can chase you into your corners where you have cover, you can just phase into a wall or teleport around. You can be so evasive even while you're the slower player that you honestly still have a pretty good chance at being able to deal with them, especially because you will be able to shoot through walls periodically, whereas they won't. A lot of the times the Evasion Phasers player is trying to bleed the other player out slowly while the other player chases them viciously around the map, going for their burst kill to make sure that they can end the game quickly. And I don't know, even though it's two very different playstyles, it does feel like it's quite an even battle between the two of them. And that's another thing that was kind of unexpected, but welcome. When it came to balancing this game, well, this isn't so much a balance concern, but I guess more like a variety concern. I was worried that while I thought we could make all the different loadouts balanced, I thought there would just simply be some loadout combinations which just made no sense. You know, there'd be no reason to run them, it would never be a smart idea, and you couldn't really fix it with balance changes, because it's not because the parts are weak, it's because the combination makes no sense. An example would be, at least in theory, using the machine gun with the Astral Anchor and the Evasion Phasers. So the main benefit of the Astral Anchor is how big and heavy you are, and so usually you'd want to be bashing into people with that, but we didn't take the Demolition Kit or the rocket launcher, so we can't rocket jump to really take advantage of that. We took the Evasion Phasers, which seems to not really make much sense with a big heavy ship like this, which takes a lot of time to build up speed, and so as a result it kind of seems like, well, surely this isn't the thing that benefits the most from the Evasion Phasers. Surely you'd want to use this with, I don't know, a bit more of an evasive ship, something like the Comet Chaser. Even the Sky Strider, because it has better control. At the very least, maybe you could salvage this if you'd taken the Slingshot as your weapon, because then at least you'd be good at long range, and while maybe it would have been better to take the Comet Chaser, I guess you do have the damage reduction with all the armor on having the Astral Anchor. If that does end up being relevant, maybe that still is a good idea. But then combine that with the fact that you took the machine gun, and at first it can seem like this is a senseless combination. But even really weird combos like this actually started working out because of small emergent features of the game that we didn't even expect, or things we just didn't think about. For example, the Astral Anchor is actually pretty fine to take with the Evasion Phasers for two reasons. Because of the fact it's the ship with the least friction and the least acceleration, that means it benefits the most from being able to completely cancel out its previous momentum and move in a new direction using the burst dash. So now that you get two burst dashes, it makes it way easier to correct mistakes with a ship that has the least ability to turn around when it needs to. Beyond that, another unexpected synergy between taking the Astral Anchor and the Evasion Phasers, a combo I was not expecting to make sense, is that because you're the heaviest ship in the game, you're also the ship that's affected the least by, well, bonking into things. If you get launched by something, you're going to get launched less with the Astral Anchor thanks to its low bounciness and high weight than any other ship in the game. Which means, as a result, you will get less cooldown increases because of being launched around the screen. So you get shorter wait times on your abilities using the Astral Anchor with the Evasion Phasers compared to using any other ship. The Sky Strider with its high bounciness would get lots of increased cooldowns, and so would the Comet Chaser with its extremely low weight. But the fact that this ship has both low bounciness and high weight means that it doesn't get bounced around a lot and gets shorter cooldowns as a result. As well as that, while I expected the Evasion Phasers to be the best with the Slingshot, and I would say that was not a bad prediction, I was surprised to see it was actually best with the machine gun a lot of the time. The machine gun was the only weapon which didn't really have a downside to using Unreal ammunition. Its shots didn't bounce off of walls, and its shots were decent to use at long range so long as you didn't spray and pray. As a result, it's typically the most effective weapon to use with Unreal ammunition. I'm not saying that this is a meta combination, one of the best combos in the game. No, certainly not that. But I am saying there's a lot of ship combos we expected would just flop that actually had a bunch of unexpected synergies that actually turned out okay. I was also expecting the Evasion Phasers would do terribly with the rocket launcher, but as I mentioned, the ability to rocket jump and propel yourself so suddenly not only is great when able to phase through walls on top of that, but also works great in combination with a teleport. The fact that you can traverse longer distances in short amounts of time means that you can teleport across longer distances as well, and carry more momentum into the teleport. Similarly, looking at the Demolition Kit, it would seem like it only makes sense to use with the machine gun or the rocket launcher, since the main appeal generally of it is to use Forceplosions to have crazy movement. But actually, the Demolition Kit is also pretty good with the Slingshot, for two reasons. One, because Forceplosions can also be used for their original intention as a get-off-me tool, and that actually does help you knock away people who launch themselves into you with Forceplosions in the first place, so you can get some distance and use your weapons as intended. But on top of that, it works well using the Steel Splitter, because of the fact that the Slingshot, while having the lowest total DPS, is the best weapon in the game for consistent long-range burst damage. If you're able to pierce your enemy's armor and instantly follow that up with a fully charged shot from the Slingshot, and yes, you can fire off abilities while holding down the charge button, not only will you do an enormous amount of burst damage, literally unparalleled by any other weapon combo in the game, but also because you did an enormous amount of burst damage, it's one of the most consistent ways to get instant refreshes on your Steel Splitter by just doing so much damage in such a small amount of time that you can refresh the debuff for the armor piercing before it even wears off. So yeah, there are very, very, very few combinations which don't make sense anymore. And even the few I could think of still would have niche use cases, though I would agree they are probably generally weaker picks. The only one that I can really think of off the top of my head is, I don't think it makes much sense to use the Slingshot with the Sky Strider if Evasion Phasers is your loadout. It just seems like that would have the worst of both worlds. You wouldn't have the heaviness and all the synergies with the Evasion Phasers that the Astral Anchor does, as well as that you wouldn't have its damage reduction, but you also wouldn't have the speed of the Comet Chaser. So you won't be able to constantly outrun your opponent and simply play from a safe range. And the extra bounciness here isn't actually much of an upside. If anything, it's a downside since it hurts your ability to use the evasion phases. You don't have anything to launch yourself with for the most part, so yeah, that's probably the only combo I can think of that doesn't make sense anymore. Even still, you could make a niche argument that, well, if you don't want to be super reliant on using your boosts, even though you have two of them now, you might still want the finer control of the Sky Strider over the heavier Astral Anchor, but maybe you still need that armor to stay alive, and so you maybe pick the Sky Strider. But overall, I'm trying to think of every other combination in the game, and it seems like every single other combination of tools, weapons, and ships now makes sense in at least some context. Which has been a pleasant surprise. I was really worried that would be the main issue, is that there would just be combos that, like, you always pick this combo, it doesn't make sense to use another ship here, why would you do it? So that's been a pleasant surprise. Which brings us on to our final topic, maps. Maps were a pretty late addition to the game, one of those things we weren't sure if we'd have time for it or not, so there's only 3. And for most of the development, we'd just been using the first map, Exoplex. Now, ironically enough, for the vast majority of the game's development, I expected that Exoplex was going to be the most balanced, quote-unquote, of the 3 maps. Just in general, it kind of gives you the ability to play from multiple different ranges. You know, you can play more in the sort of center if you want to have longer sight lines. You can play in the corners if you want shorter sight lines. Overall, it seemed like it was going to be a pretty evenly matched map for just about any weapon combination or ship. However, when I came in on the last day to get a bunch of footage of the game and we played far more games, I actually think that I've slowly developed the opinion over time that this map is kind of skewed in the machine gun's favor. Overall, it is still pretty fair. I think every weapon's got a chance, but I definitely think the machine gun wins out on this map. And a lot of that is due to the fact that it can swap between playing at long range and close range. It's like I mentioned, plenty of parts of this map good for long range, plenty of parts of this map good for close range, but it's a bit of a mix. If you're a slingshot player and you get ambushed in a corner while you were charging up your shot, you're in deep shit on this map. But conversely, if you're a rocket launcher player and you get forced to play out in the open towards the middle, then you've got a pretty bad chance of being able to combat a machine gun player. Whereas a machine gun player isn't really scared in either situation. If someone tries to ambush in a corner, like a rocket launcher player, they can obviously try and spray and pray back and actually be able to put up a fight, you know. Whereas if they get stuck in a long-range fight with a, slingshot player, unless the slingshot can pull off a bounce shot that the machine gun couldn't, they're both on pretty even footing. The sightlines here aren't quite long enough to let the slingshot abuse the machine gun player without letting them also be able to fight back pretty effectively. Of course, we want to keep these maps pretty fair for both players, so this map is completely symmetrical in all directions. Now, I'm going to skip over the second map for a moment and get back to it last, just because it's a bit of a wacky one. So let's instead next go to Cargo. Now, that first map, Exoplex, was never actually officially designed, so to speak. It was just kind of what got thrown together. So I believe that the guy who was doing the graphics for the game would have handled the making of that map. I didn't make it. However, the other 2 maps were designed by me. And while this might seem very simple, I knew this was going to be very effective. Cargo. Now, I realized this map would be pretty well balanced, but actually, I'm kind of pleasantly surprised. I think it came out more well balanced than Exoplex. I mentioned I think that the machine gun player has a bit of an edge on Exoplex. Whereas on this map, I don't know, I think this map might have turned out to become the most well balanced map in the game. I feel like every single weapon has a good chance in this map. If anything, if it does have a flaw, it might be the opposite of Exoplex, in that if there is a weapon that has a disadvantage on this map, it might be the machine gun. but certainly both the slingshot and the rocket launcher feel very good on this map. As you can see, this map is less symmetrical, but it's still diagonally symmetrical, so it's still pretty fair for both players. And the layout for this map is pretty simple. If you want to go right down the middle, then the slingshot's going to be having a field day down there. Not only can they bounce their shots between the two crates in the middle to create a nice little death trap for you, but if you try to fire at a diagonal angle, you're going to be firing down one of the longest sight lines in the entire game, where the slingshot can do an enormous amount of damage. And the slingshot is going to have a much easier time hitting you down such a long sight line as that than you will have hitting them. However, it's not a super unfair map for the slingshot that makes it super OP, because of the fact that the corners are way more close quarters and allow you to sneak up around the slingshot player. And in those corners, the rocket launcher reigns supreme. And of course, the machine gun's always a bit in the middle, being able to switch between both playstyles. Though I'd say generally the machine gun player does tend to prefer the corners as well, because of the fact that, well, that middle spot is real scary to go through if you're up against a slingshot player. The process of making this map was pretty simple. The only thing that really changed over time was that initially it was literally just the two crates in the middle. And then when we actually saw it in the game and saw how much space you had in the corners, we decided to add those little crates that are just way off to the sides and those far corners just to make those areas a little bit more cramped. Other than that, that's it for cargo. Which simply leaves our final map, Alloy. Alloy is a weird one. It's the funky map. And this is definitely the one that changed the most, though it still didn't change a crazy amount. And Alloy is the only map that has a gimmick, so to speak. These ball things. You see, I did actually program this to be possible, but I never actually got around to telling anyone else on the team at the time, because it was one of those things I thought was a stretch feature that I wasn't sure if it was going to work yet, I wasn't sure if we were going to have to do a bunch of bug fixing, and I didn't want to stress people out by throwing a bunch of stuff on their plate. But essentially, the way I had programmed the whole collision system did mean you could basically give any object you wanted collision and physics-based movement. So you could, if you wanted, have walls, have collision, you know, have cover that can be moved by shooting it or bashing into it or whatever. But again, I didn't want to put more things on people's plates. I wasn't sure if it was going to work out the box or if there was going to need to be some tweaking and bug fixing to make it work. So I didn't tell anyone. But as it turns out, I didn't need to tell anyone because the guy making the levels, like actually programming the levels and not designing them, I was designing them, but like programming them, realized you could do that anyway and decided to test it out. And he made the first version of this level, which was basically just 4 tiny boxes in the bottom corners of all the map, and then in the center, 4 of these bouncy balls. Now, of course, you can see that changed over time. It got changed to 2 of those bouncy balls, and they added 1 extra crate in the center, and then they changed it to 2 crates in the center and a gap in the very middle. That was just to make sure that the map had a little bit more cover. Although the balls themselves can be used as cover, as you can tell probably from the footage so far, it's very common that over the course of a match, the balls will eventually get knocked to the side and get stuck on a wall and then won't really act as cover anymore. That's fine. I don't mind that being a, way the map plays out. It is supposed to be cover that moves over time, Ideally, I would like it if it didn't get stuck on the wall so much, but I mean, at the end of the day, we weren't going to spend a whole bunch of extra time just making the balls, bounce harder off the walls on the side, I'm not sure. But yeah, once these balls are out the way, especially back when there was only 1 crate in the center, this map has like no cover. So that's why the second crate was added, but that wasn't enough. This map was still super unfair for the rocket launcher or the demolition kit if you tried to use it, especially if you were playing against a slingshot player. This map, the slingshot was king. There was just absolutely no cover to work with and extremely long sight lines everywhere. The problem is that when you drew it up on paper and put the balls where they started before they get bounced out of the way, this map was already starting to look a little bit cluttered, and I didn't want it to feel super cramped. In some ways, I did intentionally make this the map with the longest sight lines and the least cover. I did want that, I just didn't want it to be as bad as it was. And so I had to find a way to make this less unfair, but still keep the spirit and identity of the map. And this might sound real simple, but it really did the job. All we decided to do was quadruple the size of the boxes at the top left and bottom right corners. This made it so that even once the balls were bounced away from their initial positions, you still had some relatively cramped areas you could work from if you needed to bounce yourself off walls using explosions or Forceplosions or whatever. At the end of the day, this map is still typically not great for anyone using the rocket launcher because of the fact that they only really have these little corners that are a bit close quarters where they could be effective. But I didn't mind that so much so long as it didn't feel unwinnable. And I mean, it doesn't, because if you can use the balls effectively, you can actually be quite dominant on this map as the rocket launcher. That doesn't mean that the rocket launcher isn't the worst weapon on this map. It probably is, because getting the balls to land in the correct positions is very inconsistent. But at the very least, it doesn't feel like you don't have a chance. Again, ideally, if we get a really long time to work on this game, then, you know, this would be something we'd work on and fix, but, you know, we don't really have the resources for that. Working with what we have at the time we have, I think that that's the best we can get at. I know it might sound a bit strange, but it is actually really hard to make maps that feel different while making them feel, you know, fair and balanced. And so that's why we're kind of biting the bullet here and just accepting the rocket launcher's kind of going to suck on this map no matter what we do. Because the only way we could really fix that is to make this map far more cramped. But if we did that, then it wouldn't really have its identity of being the open map, so to speak, anymore. We basically knew this was going to be the wacky map. So we were not so much concerned with the balance side of things and more so concerned with the fun side of things, and only concerned with balance so much as it interferes with the fun. But either way, that'll do it for me. I know I spent quite a while waffling about this game, but obviously I spent hours of my life making it, so of course I've got a decent amount to say about it. And just said that, well, we're basically never going to be able to play this game again now, because of the fact that, well, it's made on a PS5 dev kit. That's why I was so insistent on getting so much footage of the game, not only for this video, but also because it's all that's really going to be left of it for me after this. The only way that we could ever, quote-unquote, take it home, so to speak, is if we actually went ahead with making it a full commercial game. But I'd have to admit, I don't think I'd be prepared to go ahead with that. With all that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.